All right, we're ready to start Basics of Biblical Hebrew, chapter 12. This is an introduction to verbs, and we will actually be studying, well, mostly, there won't be very much else, but mostly going to be verbs for them, except for a couple of chapters maybe. So we'll be doing this for a while. And check the pen here. So we'll start off with a look at the Hebrew calendar, and then we'll look at the workbook, and then we'll do the intro to Hebrew verbs and go over the vocabulary. The Hebrew calendar, sometimes we see different things in there. It's, for instance, if you're reading in the book of Exodus and Moses is talking about the Passover and he says, do it in the first month, the month of Aviv, or in English, it looks like Abib, but it's pronounced in Hebrew, Aviv. And then you're reading in Nehemiah, and he refers to the first month as Nisan. You go, what? Wait a minute, what happened here? Okay, so we have two similar but different calendars presented to us in the Hebrew scriptures. The Hebrew calendar went through some changes during and after the Babylonian captivity. So some of the months listed early in the Bible, chronologically speaking, has different names. They have different names than what we see, chronologically speaking, in the later books of the Bible. And then the modern Hebrew calendar, different from what we see in the modern Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar is a lunar-based calendar with each month starting at the new moon. The full moon is always at mid-month. This means that at Passover on the 14th of the month, the moon was full. The darkness on the day Jesus was crucified could not possibly have been attributed to an eclipse because solar eclipses can only occur during a new moon. A lunar calendar will become out of sync with a solar calendar because 12 lunar months do not add up to 365.242 days. So to handle the leap year, as it were, in the Hebrew calendar, they assign a second month of Adar. So they'll have it, and this just happened the last year, I think, recently, that you have the month of Adar, and then they have the second month of Adar. So really end up 13 months, and that keeps up with the solar year and keeps the years more closely related to our Gregorian calendar. So the Hebrew months, we have the number of the month, because a lot of times we don't even get a name. It just says in the third month, in the sixth month, or something like that. But the modern Hebrew name is in the next column, like Nisan, Iyar. The Hebrew name, or have the name is spelled out in Hebrew in the third column. Then the next column says original name. So, like I mentioned a while ago, for the Passover, initially it's called Aviv, but later it's called Nisan. And then, of course, this corresponds around the time frame of our April. That's when the Passover and unleavened bread take place. And then Iyar, and if you want to know how to pronounce these, you can always look at these Hebrew names here. Back in 1 Kings 6:1, it was called Ziv. And then some of the rest of these, if the months are mentioned, they're only mentioned by number, but I do have all of the names in this column, well, both of these columns are on the modern Hebrew calendar. And also we have the holidays. So that's the first six. And for the last six, we see another one. Tishrei is called Ethanim in 1 Kings 8:2. And then Keshvan is called Bull in 1 Kings 6:38. And the rest of them either not named or they're only referred to by number, but they don't have a different name. So those are the Hebrew months, the Hebrew calendar. That's why they're different. They adopted the Babylonian calendar while they stayed in Babylon. So let's go to the workbook. I'd ask if there are any questions on the workbook. I'll go ahead and ask if there's any questions from the workbook. The thing is, the workbook this time is it's only Bible translation, which we go over anyway. There's no other workbook sections there. So we'll just go ahead and go through the translation, starting on page 43, number 1. Vayechi, notice that's not he, Vayechi, but Vayechi. This is, and he lived, Adam. Shloshim, there's 30. When you see the im plural ending, it means it's times 10, as it were. So it's not shlosh is 3, but shloshim is 30. Uma'at and 100 year. And notice that you oftentimes will have switching back and forth between years and year. But for the big numbers, it seems like it's almost always just a year. So you just going through it woodenly, you'd say, and he lived, Adam, 30 and 100 year, or he lived 130 years is better English. Number 2, kind of the same thing, except it's Seth, Shate, and he lived, Shate, 5 years. Notice that's plural, and 100 year. So 105 years. Number 3, and he lived, Enosh, Tishim, that's 9, and it's plural, so it's going to be 90. Shana year, and he lived, Enosh, 90 year, or lived 90 years. And number 4, and he lived, Canaan, Shivim, there's Shiva, there's 7, and it's plural, so it's going to be 70 year, or years. And number 5, and he lived, Mahalalel, Kamesh is 5 years, Shanim, years, and Shishim, 60 year, which put it all together, and Mahalalel lived 65 years. Number 6, and he lived, Yered, Shataim, the Shishim. So we have Shataim is 2, and Shishim is 60. We have the im ending, so it's times 10. So it's 2 and 60 year, Shana, Uma'at, and 100 year. So, and Yerad or Jared is what's usually brought over in English, lived 162 years. And then on page 44, number 7, following the same type of reading, we have, and he lived, Metushalach, Shiva, that's 7, and Shimonim, that's 80, with the im endings, plural. Shimone is 8, but Shimonim is 80, Shana, year, Ma'at, and 100 year. So you put it all together, and Methuselah lived 187 years. Number 8, by Yihu, and they were. Notice that's a hey, not a het, so it's not lived. It's the to be verb haya, which is actually in today's vocabulary. And they were Kol Yamei, all the days of Methuselah, Methuselah. And then we have Tesha, that's 9. The and Shishim is 60. Shana. So we have 9 and 60 years, but that's not all. And Tisha, 9, Me'ot, hundreds year. So 969 years. And they were, all the days of Methuselah, 969 years. It'll split up 9 and 60 year and 900s year. Okay, number 9, we get something a little different here. We're looking at measurements, not years. Well, not time measurement, size measurements. So we have the habait, and the house, Asher, which Bana, he built. Then we have the subject, Hamelech, the king, Shlomo. So this is the house that Solomon built for Yahweh. Shishim, 60, Amma, that's cubit, 60 cubit. length of him, and esrim, when you have 10 plural, it's actually 20. So, and 20, the width of him. And then number 10, a time, that's the im is a dual ending. So it's a cubit, but it's going to be 2 cubits because it's a dual ending. So 2 cubits, v'chatzi is and a half. So 2 cubits and a half. Archa or arka is the length of her, and ama, a cubit, v'chatzi, and a half, the width of her. Any questions? All right. So we'll look at a couple of, or a few, not just a couple, but we'll look at a few Hebrew study tips. Will this get easier? Well, things that'll make Hebrew, learning Hebrew easier is work on it every day, keep up to date, do the workbook assignments, memorize the things you should memorize, such as the alphabet and the vowels, nouns and adjective endings. And by the way, like the alphabet and the vowels, I still call letters by their name and I call vowels by their name. That hasn't gone away. And if it's kind of cloudy, it'll clear up because they're not going away. We're going to continue to talk about them. Noun and adjective endings. Well, I've already talked about the eam endings, as we looked at numbers and everything, that's not going away either. So these are all things that you'll get exposed to over and again. But these are all the important things that should be memorized. The personal pronouns, independent personal pronouns, the demonstrative pronouns, pronominal suffixes, the cardinal numbers, which means the masculine cardinal numbers, which means the ones we count by, plus the variations for 2 and 100, 1,000, and 10,000. And finally, vocabulary, memorize vocabulary. So things that we need to memorize. Then another thing is write out how words are formed. You can, some examples here, or an example. An example from the workbook on page 37, that was an exercise or two back. We have ata, uvanecha, v'ishtecha. So ata is there's not much you can do with that. It's just you. Then we have the uvanecha. Split that up. We have that's and. We have ben, that's son. We have the yod in there that tells us it's plural, and then we have the second person masculine singular pronominal suffix. And so this is and the sons of you. And then we have the for and then the isht is wife, and then the second person masculine singular pronominal suffix you. So we end up with you and the sons of you and the wife of you. Or another way, if you want to do it, option B, you can just go in and draw lines. Ata, again, that's a pronoun. We can say, okay, there's a that's and here's the root is ben for son, and we have the yod for plural and kaf, pronominal suffix, and then the same thing for the wife of you. We have the and the wife and the pronominal suffix. So those are all things that you'll do in your head as you're reading, and you get faster at it as you go along. But you look at the word, what is the word, and what did they do to it? What did they add to the front? What did they put on the back? It also helps to read examples out loud. So you're by doing that, you're engaging more, not just your eyes, but also your ears. And then there's the processing in between those two things too. So those can help in learning Hebrew. Will it get easier? Yes, if you do the work. But it's worth the effort. Last week, the article at the end was a quote from Martin Luther, and that's kind of encouraging for the importance of reading Hebrew and Greek. And then I don't know whether you covered it earlier or not. When I get a book, I usually start at the beginning. I read all the preface and introduction and all the comments that are included. I always read all the pages with the Roman numerals on them. I read everything. Not everybody does that, but on pages 17 through 22 in Roman numerals, the beginning, it has a story about Bitzer the banker and the amount of work he put into it. He wasn't even like a pastor or something. He just um, tried to make it easier to keep up with reading Hebrew and anyway, it's a good story on the importance of reading Hebrew. So anyway, that's worth looking at about Bitzer the banker. All right, so let's move on to chapter 12, Introduction to Hebrew Verbs. Learning objectives, we want to get a basic understanding how verbs function, because this is, well, that's where we're turning our attention to. We understand roots and stems. We understand how verbal stems are formed. We understand the basics of verbal conjugations. Again, all of these things are not going away. We're going to be talking about these things for the rest of the class. And we're going to be able to identify strong and weak verbs. And again, we will be talking about that till we finish the book. That's not going away. So basically, we want to look at verbs, how they function. Verbs describe action or state of being, action. He ate, state of being, he is happy, enjoyed his meal. Verbs do the work in the language. The word for work is poal, and it's also the modern Hebrew word for verb, means verb or work. It does show up in the Old Testament. I don't remember how many times. I didn't look it up. But we're going to use this word poal to identify the various verb stems, what happens to a word. So we'll talk more about that. We want to talk about inflection. Inflection is when a word changes its form. And English has some inflection. Hebrew has lots of inflection. Hebrew words change their forms. So English verbs inflect for person. Not all verbs do, very few. It doesn't matter whether I ran, you ran, or he ran. Ran is the same. So most English verbs do not change, but the to be verbs do. So we'll look at those. First person is I am, second person you are, third person she is. But most verbs do not inflect, or they don't inflect very much. And so we have first person I eat, you eat, she eats. It doesn't change hardly at all. But it does for the to be verb, am, are, is. So we do get some inflection in English. English verbs do not inflect for gender. So it doesn't matter if he is, that's the third person masculine singular. What if you're talking about a woman? The third person feminine singular, she is. The verb doesn't change, is and is. If we look at the plurals, they are, whether it's masculine or whether it's plural, third person is still they are. So are, we have is and are, singular and plural. No inflection for gender. English verbs inflect for number. So we have I am, you are, she is for second, third person singular. And then for the plurals, we are, you are, they are. So we have some inflection for number. Of course, the second person singular looks like all the third persons. So again, English only inflects a little. Hebrew inflects a lot. So does Greek. So Hebrew verbs inflect for person, for second and third person. Hebrew verbs inflect for gender, either masculine, feminine, or common. But what do we mean by common? Well, in Hebrew, everything is masculine or feminine, but common means that it doesn't matter whether you're masculine or feminine, or it doesn't have to be a person, even like the land, that's feminine. Every noun is going to be feminine or masculine, but when we're talking about verbs, inflections of verbs, We have common forms as well, and it means it's used by both masculine and feminine nouns. And they inflect for number, singular and plural. There are no dual inflections for verbs. There's dual for nouns, but not for verbs. It's always going to be singular or plural. Normal word order for Hebrew clauses is verb, subject, object. That's why when we've done our workbook, and I often say, here's good Hebrew word order, because it gives us the verb, and he said, well, who said it? And then we have somebody, Moses said, something like that. We get the subject afterwards. In this illustration, bara, he created. Then we get the subject, Elohim. Nobody created Elohim. Elohim is a subject. He created Elohim. So Elohim created. For English, we have to bring the subject before the verb because that's how we do it in English. And then the object, by the way, these are color coded with verb, subject, object. We have he created. Who did it? God. God created the heavens and the earth. All right. Next, we want to look at roots and stems. A root is the origin or simplest form from which words are derived. Okay, we're going to talk more about it. We're going to have some examples here soon. The root is composed of consonants only, no vowels. And the root is hypothetical, meaning that nobody back in Moses' day or Abraham's day went through and said, okay, here's the root. This is what we come up with looking back at what they did and coming up with it. Now, the call, we haven't started talking about stems yet, but the call stem usually follows the root. And then we have derived stems that are based upon the call. But some verbs do not appear in the call at all. And so we say, well, here's this word. We never see it in call, but this would be the root. And so it's hypothetical from that. It's reverse engineering. Let's call it that. It's like reverse engineering. We're going back and finding where did this word come from? Okay, that's what a root is. A stem is the most basic form of any word derived from a root. So we have a root, we're going to derive a word from it, and the basic form is the stem. We want to keep track that a root and a stem are not the same thing. A root is here. A stem is here. The stem is not the root, and the root is not the stem. Of course, that's kind of an ugly picture of a flower. I'm sorry, that's about the best I can do. I've never had artistic talent. But just to illustrate that a root and a stem are different things. Now we'll talk about those things in more detail. So most Hebrew words have a three-letter root, not all, but most. And so we have the root mem, lamed, kaf. And that means that has to do with something about royalty, whether it's king or kingdom or something like that, or queen. That's what this root is. From this root, mem, lamed, kaf, we can build nouns like Melech is king, Malkah is queen, and Malkut is kingdom. So you can see Melech, and Melech. Those are all based off of this root, but the inflections tell us something else about it. Okay, king, queen, kingdom. From that same root, we can also make verbs. And so we get malach. Now this would be the call. I've mentioned that already. The call is the simple form. And most of the time, the call is really closely related to the root. All right. So, but as a verb, malach means he reigned. He reigned. And that's actually going to be a third masculine singular form, he reigned. Okay. Or we can have, this would end up being the he feel. We'll talk about that more later. We see that something has changed here. We've got a he added to the front. We get this uric yod added to it, but we can still see the root here. Let's get rid of some of these. The root minus the uric yod. We still see the root there. And oh, and by the way, that means he caused to be king. He caused to be king. So you would see that in something like when Samuel anointed Saul, he caused him to be king. Right? That'd be the type of word there. Most Hebrew roots have three letters. Like we looked at Mem, Lamed, Kaf, for royal type things, king type things. Devar is used for words or speaking. Depends on whether it's a noun, or if it's a noun, it's a word. If it's a verb, it's speaking. Rosh is head. Um, it, it can be used for first something. Shaphat. Shaphat is a judge. Well, if it's a noun, it could be a judge, or if it's a verb, it could be like to judge, or he judged, or something like that. So all of these are examples of three-letter roots to words from which we can make nouns and verbs. Okay, so there's a difference between stems and roots and stems. Now, how are the verbal stems formed? I should have made mention. I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to go back to the grammar, and I'm going to go back to the very first part. There's some things I want to make note of here. It's kind of in the middle of the teaching, but I want to point out the very first paragraph, 12.1. This is on page 115. Page 115, very first paragraph, 12.1. Third line up from the bottom. However, there is no need to memorize the Hebrew verbal forms in this chapter. Please keep that in mind. Verbs are important. They've got some good statistics here. In the Hebrew Bible, there are just over 23,000 verses. In these verses, approximately 72,000 verbs, averaging about 3 verbs per verse for each verse of the Bible. It's interesting, but it doesn't help me with reading, but it helps know the importance of verbs. So you don't have to memorize all these things. Seemed like there was something else here. Oh, also the fact on page 116, the very next page, we see that they say this system of deriving different words from a common root should be a point of encouragement, since it can take some of the pain out of vocabulary memorization. You'll see a word and you go, wait a minute, I already had that word as a vocabulary word. Well, you may have had it as a noun. Now you get it as a verb. They still usually have some related meaning in there. And so it does make it easier for vocabulary. Let's see. I think that's it for now. I'm going to leave that open. So let's go back to the screen here. So the names of the Hebrew verbal stems, these are not the root. These are based off the root. Is call, which bears the most resemblance to the root. Call means light or swift or easy. And so we'll see when we look at examples, we'll see why. Nephal is the next stem we'll learn. Then we'll learn the Hephil and the Hophal and the Piel and the Pual and the Heat-Palel. These are the 7 major stems. There are some others that are not as common, but we'll be spending a lot of time on these. We're going to spend a lot of time on call. We're going to look at it in a lot of detail. Once we have all the basics down, after that, it's just a matter of variation, adding some letters or changing some vowels, but a whole lot of the stuff stays exactly the same. There's a lot to learn here when we learn the chapter 13 and chapter 15, especially. But then after that, when we learn the preformatives and subformatives, those won't change. You want to make sure you stick with this because it's going to get easier, because once you have it memorized, you're going to use those for the rest of the book in all these verb stems. So looking at them in Hebrew then, call, well, that's just, easy or light. But then we have that word for work or verb, and notice that the root is there. Now we have a hierarch yod in there, but we still see the root. We see the root, see the root, see the root, see the root. And something has been added. Now the thing that's been added, let's get those out of the way, like knee fall. Well, we see the knee, and looky there, there's knee, and here's the A is the patak there, knee fall. So what do you do to the word uh, uh, sorry, this word for verb or this word for work? What do we do to it for these different stems? Well, for knee fall, you had the knee and the ah. For he feel, you had the he and the eel, or not necessarily the lamed, but here it goes. Hoful, you get the ho, because it's a closed unaccented syllable, and you get the a vowel in there. Piel, you get the I vowel and the sere vowel. Pual, you get the U vowel, kibbutz, and the patak. Heat, you get the heat added to the front. So all of these names in the second column there are reflecting what's happening to all of these forms here. So, and I'm going to have to erase this to make room for the rest of this. So these are called, the bottom 6 are called derived stems. They're derived from the call. And that's why we're going to spend so much time on call. We have to learn call. Then after that, it's just a matter of looking at what changed, what is buried in it. So all of these are built on that Pa'al or Poal stem. So let's look at this a little bit differently. We have the root. This is a Kof, Tet, Lamed. From that, we're going to build the call stem, the simple, the light, the easy, the fast stem. So all we've basically done is added the comets and the patak to it. And really, this is the most common way to get from the root to the call, is by adding those 2 vowels. So that's the call stem. And then from that, we have the derived stems. And so, by the way, katal, we'll be using that. It has the root meaning of kill. So for the call, it means he killed. And it seems kind of gruesome to use a word for killing. We'll be using killing for the rest of the class. It's just something that's become an established pattern. I mean, we could use katav or write. He wrote, she wrote, or something like that. But we're going to stick with katal. That's what the book uses, and practically every grammar I've ever seen does that. So anyway, he killed. But we take this katal stem, this call stem, and katal, and we see that the knee was added, and we get the a vowel. We see the he, and the here yod was added. So you basically take the stem, you turn it into a verb, and then from call we derive all these other stems. And we're going to be spending a couple of chapters on every one of these. All right. This is called the diagnostic method of learning to read Hebrew. Diagnostic comes from Greek. We have dia, which means through, and then gnostic is knowledge, through knowledge. So we're going to memorize the basics, and then we're going to play Sherlock Holmes. We're going to look at the evidence, and we're going to diagnose or deduce, if you will, what happened to the word, and we're going to understand how it's being used, how we should understand it, how we should translate it. So if you look at page 117, 12.6, you can see that they have all the variants for the different stems. They put them in red letters, which that's better than my circles on my screen. So it gives you the things that we'll be looking at. You don't have to memorize these. We're going to cover all of these in future chapters. But it'll be a while before we get to most of them, because we're going to spend a lot of time in the call. We have to learn what normal is before we can begin to deduce or diagnose what changed. Why are there so many stems? We don't really have tenses in Hebrew, but we have these stems. Why do we have these stems? Stems express voice and kind of action. All right, so what do we mean by voice? Well, active voice is when the subject does the action. He broke, and we put whatever it. He broke it. It is an object, but we're just looking at how the verb is related to the subject. So active, the subject is doing it. If it's passive, it's happening. The action is happening to the subject. It was broken. And that's how we do it in English. Was, we put it was. Or sometimes being or something like that. But that's the passive. The action happens to the subject. The subject isn't doing it. However, if the subject is doing the action and the subject is acting upon himself, like he hit himself or it broke itself, that sounds like something your kids would say when you say, "Who broke the cookie jar?" "Oh, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. It broke itself." No, it didn't. But that's what reflexive means. It means that the subject is acting on themselves or on behalf of themselves in some way. They're doing the action and also receiving the action. Now, the action, what kind of action is being communicated by stems? We have the simple action, he broke, and then we have intensive action, is he smashed or he shattered. And we'll talk more about that when we get to those, because the whole idea of intensive is bigger than that. But this is a good place to start. This is painting with a broad brush. It's a good place to start. So he broke is simple. He smashed is intensive, or he shattered. And causative would be he caused to break. So those are the different types of actions. Those are the different types of voices. And so we put those together. What English does by adding words, Hebrew does by changing stems. So we have the types of action, simple, causative, and intensive. And we have the voice, active, the subject is doing it, passive, it's happening to the subject, or reflexive, the subject is acting upon themselves in some way. And so this is the way that breaks down. Notice that Nephal does double duty. Sometimes, so was David hidden or did David hide himself? If it's Nephal, it could be translated either way. And this chart is at the top of page 120. So if you're trying to hurry up and write it down, you don't have to. It's in the book. All right, so that's why we have all these stems, because they're communicating the kind of action and they're telling us who's doing the action, or whether the action is happening to the subject's doing it, or acting upon themselves. Okay. What English does by adding words, Hebrew does by changing stems. He broke is shavar. Shavar, he broke. That's the call stem. And again, when you hear this, when you see this Comet's patak verb combination, that's common for the call. And this is going to be a third masculine singular verb here, which was he broke. So shavar, it was broken. Now it's passive. That's going to be a knee fall. And we see the knee added to it. And we see the patak under there. It's niche bar. It was broken. That's the knee fall. It broke itself. Okay, this is the subject acting upon itself. It's for simple action. It's still going to be knee fall. Okay. He smashed. That's going to be intensive. So it's shibar, shibar. Or I mean, sorry, shibar, shibar. And that's going to be PL. And then it was smashed, passive. It's still intensive, but it's passive. And this is going to be pual. So we have the U vowel there with the kibbutz, shubar. Shubar means it was smashed, the pual stem. It smashed itself. That's going to be heat palel. And so we're going to get heat shaber. Okay. And then he caused to break. That's going to be hish beer. Hish beer. That's going to be the he feel. And then it was caused to break. That's passive. It's still causal action, but it's passive action. That's going to be the hopeful. So we have hoshbar, hoshbar, or that hopeful. So that's the different kinds of actions um, and voices expressed for all these different stems. The call stem and then all the derived stems. By the way, these gray ones, these words do not appear in scripture, but that's the way they would have, if they did, that's what they'd look like. All right. So now we need to understand the basics of verbal conjugations. What's that? What's a conjugation? Those are covered on pages 121 through 123. They give you detailed information on it, but in summary, there are 6. So conjugations express verbal functions. So we have the perfect, the imperfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, the infinitive absolute, and participle. Those are the conjugations. The perfect, that is used to indicate completed action. Because of that, it is almost always going to be translated in the past because it's a completed action. He ran the race. Well, if he was still running it, you'd say it differently. He is running, or he was running, or something like that. But anyway, perfect is a completed action. He broke. The imperfect is an incomplete action, so it's going to be translated either as a present or most of the time as a future. He will break. Imperative is a command, yeah, for the second person, and so it's just break. It's telling somebody to do it. Infinitive construct is like it's a verbal noun like our English infinitive, and to break. And then the infinitive absolute, well, it's also a verbal noun, but there's nothing like it in English. But that doesn't mean it's going to be hard to understand. In fact, we'll talk about that again on the next slide. Let's go on to participle, which we also have in English. It's a verbal adjective, and so breaking would be the way that functions. So those are the 6 conjugations. So the conjugations are expressing completed action, incomplete action, if it's a command, or if it's a verbal noun, or if it's a participle, verbal adjective. Okay, regarding the infinitive absolute, there's no precise equivalent in English. We do have a whole chapter on it, but it's a short chapter, chapter 21. It's only 8 pages long. Infinitive absolutes occur 817 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and they're chiefly used for emphasis. How does that work? Whenever the king is going to have somebody executed, he might say, "You shall surely die." Okay, that surely in there, "you shall surely die," is for emphasis. In Hebrew, it says, "To die, you will die." To die, you will die. That's the infinitive absolute. So it's not hard to recognize it all. In fact, you usually have whatever verb you have, like die, you're going to have "to die, you will die." You'll see that same verb in 2 places right in a row. So they're very easy to catch. And sometimes it's also, so this is like I said, chiefly, most of the time it's used for emphasis, but there are other uses and simultaneous actions. So if you're walking and talking, or walking and eating, or something like that, or you're going up and weeping. Well, I already said walking and eating. So when you have simultaneous action, it'll use an infinitive absolute for that. For instance, when Samson had killed the lion, but then he's coming later and he found there was honey in it, he was eating the honey and walking at the same time. And so we have an infinitive absolute for that. But we'll talk more about those when we get to chapter 21. You don't have to memorize it, but now you've heard it, and when we get to it, you'll say, "Oh yeah, I remember that." And then finally, we want to be able to identify strong and weak verbs, because we'll have chapters for strong and weak verbs. So let's back up. Strong verbs are verbs that do not undergo changes because of the letters. Weak verbs undergo changes because of the letters. Why? What letters? Well, we've talked about this before, that the yod, the vav, the nun, and the hey, of course we're reading this way, Um, those letters have a tendency to drop out of words. Now, those happen to be the same letters that make up the name Yonah, or we say in English Jonah. In Hebrew, that means dove. That's the word for dove. So when Noah sent the dove out of the ark, it was a Yonah that he sent out. Anyway, that's just an easy way to remember what letters drop out. Well, it's the same letters that are in Jonah, the name Jonah. And so there they go, they drop out. So we also have weak consonants. We have letters that drop out. We have weak consonants that affects the spelling of words. So the Yonah letters, Yod, Vav, Nun, Hey letters, those can drop out. Those are weak consonants. Gutturals are weak consonants. Aleph, Hey, Het, Ayin, they don't drop out, but they affect how the vowels work, things like that. We'll see. And sometimes resh, not just the gutturals, but sometimes resh, not always resh. And then there's other weak verbs. We have biconsonantals. That's roots having only two. I'll have some examples of this in a couple of slides here. Having only two consonants, and then there's the geminate. Gemini means twins. And so that means the second and third consonants are the same letter. Those are also considered weak verbs or weak letters that, as opposed to a strong verb. Weak consonants are classified by their position in a word. For instance, we see that ayin. Well, first of all, that's the call form. How do we know it's call? Because we have this vowel combination here. You don't have to memorize that. I'm just getting you used to thinking about it. And so when we're looking at the root of that, the root is actually, if you took the vowels out, that's the root right there, ayin, mem, dalet, okay? So when we refer to the roots, we'll refer to the R1 or root 1. Now, let's do this. The root 1 or R1, the R2, and the R3. So it's just referring to which letter it is. And this one, if the first letter is a guttural, so this would be a one guttural, a one guttural weak verb. So as long as you remember your gutturals and stuff like that, the letters that drop out, it's pretty easy to remember what these are. So that's a one guttural. Let's use a different word. This one is a two guttural. You see the two position is an aleph. That's a guttural. Camille's not a guttural. Llama's not a guttural. This is a two guttural weak verb. Okay. And we have barak. So bait is not a weak letter, and neither is, in this case, the resh is not a weak one, but the het is. So this is a three het and ayin we classify. We put those two letters together. A three het ayin weak verb. Then matzah, the mem is fine, the tzadeh is fine, but this is a three aleph weak verb. Bana, this is the only one we see that's not a strong letter is the hey. That's a guttural, but we call this a three hey. This is a three hey weak verb. By the way, these two are not going away. We're going to be looking at weak verbs for every single stem. And so if you don't get all this and you say, oh, I can't remember, is that a three guttural or what? Or is it a three hey? Or we're going to be seeing these over and over and over again, so don't sweat it. Okay. Yashav means either he sat or he dwelled. So what's weak there? Well, yod, that's in like Yonah. So it's one of those that drop out. So this is a one yod weak verb. Nafal. Now we see the noon at the beginning. Remember that Yonah, the noon often drops out. So this is a one noon weak verb. Allah, we have a couple of things here. First, the ayin is a guttural, and so is the hey. So we have two gutturals. And so we call this a doubly weak verb. It's a one guttural and three hey, doubly weak, because there's two. We have comb. What happened to two? We don't have a two. Actually, there would be, if you look it up, there'd be a vav in here between the kof and the mem. There'd be a vav. If you look it up in the dictionary, but in some, and it does show up in some forms. It doesn't show up in all forms. But we call this a hollow, we call it a hollow verb, or sometimes it's called a two vav yod verb, or it's called biconsonantal weak verb. Any of those work. I don't usually say biconsonantal because I have a hard time saying it, as you can probably tell. But I do often use the word hollow or two vav yod. I use both of those terms most of the time myself. The book always likes to use the hard pronouncing. So we'll be seeing that a lot too. But that's what that is. That's a weak verb. And then savav. Notice the twins here. We have two baits right in a row. Twins. So this is a geminate. It's a geminate weak verb. And that is pretty much what you have to learn. But you, like I say, you're going to be seeing these over and over and over again as we go through most of the remaining chapters. So let's go ahead and go over vocabulary on page 126. Okay. And most of these verbs, let's see, all of these verbs are actually call. You see that comets patak combination. And so these are actually going to be, well, it says, let's take the first one, achal. Achal means to eat, but actually that particular form means he ate. He ate. And why is it he ate? Is because it's a completed action. It's a perfect. We will be studying that in the next chapter. You don't have to remember all that now. That's coming up next chapter. But anyway, achal means to eat. Amar means to say. So it'd be he said. Haya is to be. So that would be, if you saw that in the Hebrew text, you'd say he was. Halach, he walked. Yatsa, he went out. Notice in the he fill, it says cause to go out. You see this a lot when it says, when Moses is talking about Yahweh is the one who took you out of the land of Egypt, it's almost always going to be, he caused to go out you. He caused you to go out from the land of Egypt. So you see that a lot. So anyway, Yatsa, it would be, again, literally, he went out. Yashav means to sit or dwell. I don't know which one it does most. I think dwell is probably the more common meaning. Nagash, okay, we see a problem here because we have that one noon that's going to drop out sometimes, but nagash means to draw near. And whenever you're bringing your offering, you will cause it to come near, which means you brought it. So that's what the he feel there says, bring near or bring a sacrifice, offer a sacrifice. You're causing it to come near in the he feel. But just for the word, for the vocabulary word nagash. Natan, very common word. He gave, to give. We'll have to look at that more fully. This word changes forms because you've got that noon that drops out at the beginning, and sometimes the second noon does too. But we'll worry about that down the road. Asa is to do or make. He made, he did. Ra'ah, he saw. Shema, he heard. However, Shema also is used to mean obey. For instance, if the mother tells the child several times to do something, the child is not obeying. She says, you're not listening to me. And that's kind of the tie there. It's listening, but it's also can be obeying. And of course, that's where we get the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, that's based on that word. Those are the verbs. The other words, ach is only or surely most of the time. All means it's no or not. It's a negative particle. Im means if, and they've got ki-im, but or except or only. That'd be like because if, it wouldn'tly. Ball, that also means no, but you don't see it very often. It appears only 73 times, 69 of those, meaning there's only four other times. That's in Isaiah, Psalms, and Proverbs. It's mostly used in poetry. And Isaiah is, you say, that's a prophet. Well, it is, but a lot of it's poetry, written in poetic form. Then lo, that's no or not, and this is by far the most common negative particle. If you look over here to the right, you see 5,189 times as opposed to all, which is only 729 times, or ball, which is only 73 times. So lo is the most common negative. And there are some rules on which one you use, and we'll cover that when we get to those times. Atah. Atah means now. You might say atah means you, talking to a man, and you're right, but that atah starts with an aleph. This atah starts with an ayin. Say, but they're both silent. Yep, they are. And this is one of the reasons why it's easier, I think, to read Hebrew than to listen to somebody, because then you have to figure out which word they're using because it sounds exactly the same. But this atah means now, and then tamid means continually. Now, just a note on 1219, this article, it's by Ulrich Zwingli. Keep in mind, this was written a long time ago, and he talks about the importance of Latin. And I disagree. He was closer to Latin back in his day, because that was back like from 1484 to 1531. He was a part of the Reformation in Switzerland, and Latin was used a lot back then. So, but it's not so much for us now. I've thought about trying to learn Latin, and I thought, why would I want to translate a translation? You're getting a translation from a translation. So I just have not felt that it was important for me to go there. So that's in some of his views on things like the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and just take some of what he says with a grain of salt. But the main thing here is to be encouraged to study the languages. If you have any questions in particular, let me know on that. Yeah, enough said on that. So homework, go ahead and memorize chapter 12 vocabulary. Go ahead and work on exercise 12 in the workbook, and go ahead and read chapter 13, call perfect strong verbs. That one will have a lot of memorization. Chapter 13 is going to be big. Chapter 15 is going to be big also, because we're learning the call perfect paradigm, and we're going to learn the call imperfect paradigm. But take heart. Once you learn the subformatives for the perfect, or once you learn the preformatives and subformatives for the imperfect, you will be using those in all the other stems, and they will not change. They will always be the same. And so take heart in that we're learning the diagnostic method. You learn these, and you don't have to learn all of the others. All we have to do is use diagnostics. All we have to do is to deduce the stems. So we'll have more on that later, but it'd be good to go ahead and get into that. Are there any questions? All right, then we will finish.